World War II. When we hear these words, images flash before our eyes: battles, destroyed cities, millions of soldiers. But today, I want to tell you a story that few people know about. A story about women who found themselves on the other side of the ocean, far from home, with the status of prisoners of war. Picture this: 1945. The war in Europe is coming to an end. Thousands of German soldiers are surrendering to the Allies. But among them weren't just men. There were women too, serving in various auxiliary units of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Their fate took an unusual turn. Many of them ended up in prisoner-of-war camps on the territory of the United States of America. And it was there that something happened that deeply shocked these women. Something simple and mundane for Americans, but incredible for those who had spent recent years in wartime Germany. They received soap. Real soap for showering. This detail might seem insignificant, but behind it lies an entire story about how war changed everyday life, about the contrast between war-torn Europe and distant America, about human dignity in the most difficult circumstances. First, it's important to understand: who were these German women who found themselves in American captivity? In Nazi Germany, women didn't serve in combat units, but they played an important role in the Third Reich's war machine. With the onset of total war, more and more women were drawn into service in various auxiliary organizations. There was an organization called Helferinnen, Women Helpers of the Wehrmacht. They worked as communications specialists, telephone operators, radar operators. There were women in the Luftwaffe helping to operate anti-aircraft guns, although formally they weren't considered combatants. Many served in the SS Helferinnenkorps, the SS Auxiliary Corps. They worked in hospitals, administrative departments, handled documentation. Some, unfortunately, served as guards in concentration camps. Their fate after the war was entirely different, as they faced trial for war crimes. But the majority of German women in military uniform were ordinary staff members performing routine work. Among them were young girls from middle-class families who believed the propaganda, housewives called up for service through mobilization, and those simply trying to survive in conditions of total war. By the end of the war, when the Allies entered Germany, many of these women were captured. Most remained in Europe, in camps on the territory of Germany, France, and Belgium. But some were transported across the Atlantic, to the United States. Why? America in those years held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war on its territory, about 380,000 people. This was a logistical decision. Prisoners were kept far from the theater of military operations and their labor was used in agriculture and industry, which was permitted under the Geneva Convention. Women among these prisoners were few, several hundred, perhaps 1,000. Exact figures remain a subject of historical debate to this day. Imagine these women sailing on a military transport ship across the Atlantic. Many of them had never seen the ocean before. Many had spent recent years under bombardment, in crumbling cities, where each day was a struggle for survival. The ocean journey took about 2 weeks. Conditions aboard were Spartan but not cruel. American military personnel followed the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. Prisoners were fed and provided with basic medical services. But what was going through these women's minds? German propaganda had spent years telling them that the Allies, especially the Americans, were barbarians, that prisoners faced a terrible fate. Many expected the worst. Some women recounted later that during the voyage they tried to imagine what awaited them. Would they be forced to work hard? Would they be treated cruelly? Would they ever see their homes, their families again? Meanwhile, the ship was approaching the shores of America, a country that hadn't known war on its own territory, a country where factories operated at full capacity, producing unprecedented quantities of weapons, equipment, food, and everyday consumer goods. To understand the German prisoners' surprise, we need to understand what America was like during the war. Yes, the United States was at war. Yes, there was rationing of certain goods, mobilization of millions of men. But American territory wasn't subjected to bombing. American cities didn't lie in ruins. American industry was thriving. The U.S. became, in President Roosevelt's phrase, the arsenal of democracy. Factories worked around the clock, producing tanks, aircraft, ships. But simultaneously, goods for the civilian population were also being manufactured. American women worked in factories, replacing men who had gone to the front. They riveted aircraft, assembled engines, welded steel. The symbol of this era was Rosie the Riveter, an image of a strong working woman. But at the same time, you could buy soap in American stores. Real soap, not ersatz. You could buy toothpaste, shampoo, cosmetics. Yes, some goods were in short supply, distributed through ration cards. But basic items were available. The U.S. chemical industry produced soap on an industrial scale. Companies like Procter & Gamble, Colgate, and Lever Brothers continued operating, supplying products for both the military and civilian population. For Americans, soap was something completely ordinary. Something you don't think about. You take a shower with soap and forget about it. But for Europe, and especially for Germany in the final war years, this was a luxury. Now let's transport ourselves to wartime Germany. What was happening there with such simple things as soap? With the outbreak of war, the Nazi regime imposed strict resource conservation. The entire economy was reoriented toward military needs. Production of goods for the civilian population sharply decreased. Soap requires fats, animal or vegetable. These fats were needed for producing explosives, glycerin, and other substances vital for the war effort. The choice was simple: soap or ammunition. The regime chose ammunition. As early as 1939, Germany introduced a ration card system for soap. Each person received a tiny piece per month, about 50 to 100 grams. This was barely enough for basic hygiene. But with each year of war, the situation worsened. By 1943 to 1944, there was practically no real soap. What was distributed through ration cards was ersatz, a substitute made from clay, sand, and various chemical compounds. It lathered poorly, irritated the skin, and had a disgusting smell. German women tried to make soap themselves at home. They collected fat from bones, ash for lye. But even this became increasingly difficult. There wasn't enough raw material or fuel for cooking. Under constant bombardment, when cities were turning into piles of rubble, when there wasn't enough food, water, or shelter, hygiene took a back seat. People couldn't wash properly for months. Imagine life in a bomb shelter, in a basement where there might not even be running water. Imagine that water is precious, every drop counts. You can wash only occasionally, with cold water, without soap. Hair becomes greasy, skin gets covered with dirt, the smell. For women raised in the German tradition of cleanliness and order, this was particularly hard. Germans had always prided themselves on their culture of cleanliness and tidiness. And suddenly, the impossibility of maintaining basic hygiene. Many German women serving in the military had slightly better conditions than the civilian population. But even they rarely had soap. What was issued in barracks was of low quality. By the end of the war, in the spring of 1945, when these women were captured, many of them hadn't seen normal soap for months, if not years. So, the women prisoners of war arrive in America. They're taken to camps specially organized for holding prisoners. These camps were most often located in rural areas, in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and other states. They consisted of complexes of barracks behind barbed wire, with guard towers. But conditions there were incomparably better than in war-torn Germany. The barracks were sturdy, with heating. There were mess halls where they were fed 3 times a day. Medical care. And, importantly for our story, showers. The arrival procedure at the camp was standard. Prisoners were registered, checked for diseases, and given sanitary processing. And it was here that the very event occurred that amazed the German women. They were led to the showers. Many probably felt fear. German propaganda had told all sorts of horrors about what was done to prisoners. A collective shower in an unfamiliar place, under the supervision of strangers. But then they were given soap. Real soap. Not a piece of ersatz the size of a postage stamp, but a full bar of toilet soap. Sometimes not even one bar, but several, for the body, for the hair. Imagine their feelings. After years of shortage, after months when basic cleanliness was an unattainable luxury. And now, warm water flowing from the shower, and in your hands real soap that lathers, that smells normal. Many women recounted later that this was the moment when they first felt like human beings again after a long time. Not soldiers, not prisoners, not cogs in a war machine, but people. Women who could be clean. Some cried in the shower. From relief, from surprise, from accumulated emotions. War, captivity, an uncertain future, and suddenly this simple human joy, washing with soap. American guards observing the procedure didn't always understand this reaction. For them, soap was routine. But those who were more perceptive gradually realized these women had come from hell. From a world where everything was destroyed, where the simplest things didn't exist. Life in American POW camps was strictly regulated but generally conformed to international standards. Women were held separately from men, in special sections. There were few of them, so conditions were sometimes even better than for male prisoners. The daily routine was clear: wake up, breakfast, work or activities, lunch, free time, dinner, lights out. Prisoners were used for work, most often in agriculture, in fields and orchards. This was permitted under the Geneva Convention, and small compensation was provided for labor. They were fed well, according to American military standards. Meat, vegetables, bread, milk. For those who had survived hungry Germany in the final war years, this was abundance. But let's return to the topic of hygiene. Soap was issued regularly. There was an opportunity to shower several times a week, sometimes more often. Towels were provided, sometimes even toothbrushes and paste. For German women, this was a return to civilization. The ability to be clean, neat, well-groomed, this is part of feminine dignity, part of self-respect. And here, in captivity, with the enemy, they received what they didn't have at home. A paradox of war: a prisoner in a camp lived better than civilians in destroyed Germany. She was safe from bombing, she was fed, she was clean. Many women wrote letters home. This was permitted, although letters were naturally censored. In these letters, they couldn't openly write about their surprise at living conditions. This would contradict German propaganda. But hints slipped between the lines. Everything here is not as we were told. I'm being treated properly. We have everything necessary. Of course, it was still captivity. Behind barbed wire, under guard, far from home. Many women worried about the fate of their families in Germany, where the war continued, where bombs fell, where there was hunger and devastation. But in the camp, there was a strange stability. The war was somewhere out there, far away. And here, routine, order, and the opportunity to take a shower with soap every week. The story about soap isn't just a curiosity, not just an amusing detail. It's a window into understanding deeper psychological processes. First, it was a blow to propaganda. Nazi Germany had spent years instilling in its population that enemies were barbarians, that captivity was worse than death, that the Allies would treat prisoners cruelly. And suddenly women find themselves in captivity, and they're given soap. They're fed. They're treated humanely. How do you reconcile this with years of propaganda? Many German prisoners, both women and men, went through a process that could be called an awakening. They began to understand that they had been lied to. That the world wasn't what propaganda had painted it to be. Second, it was a question of dignity. In conditions of war, hunger, and devastation, a person loses many attributes of normal life. Dirt, lice, diseases, this humiliates, this deprives a person of a sense of their own worth. The ability to be clean is a restoration of dignity. It's a return to humanity. And the fact that this was happening in captivity, with the enemy, was a particularly powerful experience. Third, it was contrast. The contrast between a totalitarian system that had subordinated all life to war, deprived people of the most basic things, and a democratic society that even in war maintained a certain standard of living, certain values. The United States, for all its problems and shortcomings, didn't turn its country into a military camp. Americans didn't live in starvation. They had soap. And they could give soap even to their enemies because that's what international norms and their own concepts of humanity required. For some German women, this experience became the beginning of a reassessment. Not for everyone, of course. Some remained convinced Nazis until the end. But many began to wonder, maybe we were fighting on the wrong side. Maybe we were lied to. After the war, when these women returned to Germany, they carried this experience with them. The experience that the enemy turned out to be more humane than their own regime. The war ended in May 1945. But German prisoners of war didn't return home immediately. The repatriation process took months, sometimes years. Women were sent home earlier than men, usually by the end of 1945 or early 1946. They crossed the Atlantic again, this time in the opposite direction. They were returning to a destroyed country. Germany lay in ruins. Cities were bombed out, industry was destroyed, millions were dead, millions missing. Hunger, cold, poverty. For many, the return was a shock. There, in America, in the camp, they had lived better than they now did at home, in freedom. There was no soap in post-war Germany for several more years. Only with the beginning of the Marshall Plan, with economic recovery, did simple goods gradually begin to appear. These women told their stories. Not always openly. In post-war Germany, the topic of captivity was complex. But in the circle of family and friends they shared. You know, there in America we had soap. Real soap. For some, this sounded almost unbelievable. How could it be? With the enemy, in captivity, it was better than at home. But this story is part of a broader truth about World War II. The truth about how totalitarian regimes destroy the lives of their citizens. How war destroys not only people but the very fabric of normal life. And about how even in the darkest circumstances, even in captivity, simple human care, warm water, a bar of soap, a clean towel, can restore a person's hope and dignity. The story of German women prisoners of war surprised by soap in American camps is more than just a curious historical fact. It's a reminder that war isn't just about battles and politics. It touches the everyday lives of millions of people. It deprives them of the simplest things: cleanliness, comfort, dignity. It's also a story about the contrast between systems. About the difference between a society that mobilized all resources for total war and a society that maintained a balance between military needs and normal life. And it's a story about humanity. About how even enemies can and should be treated humanely. That observing international norms, caring for prisoners of war, this isn't weakness, but a sign of civilization. Many of those German women lived long lives in post-war Germany. They witnessed their country's reconstruction, the economic miracle, Germany's transformation into a prosperous democracy. And perhaps sometimes, taking a shower in their homes, they remembered that moment when they first held a bar of real soap in their hands after a long time. In a prisoner of war camp, across the ocean, where they understood that the world was more complex than propaganda had told them. Soap, such a simple thing. But sometimes simple things tell the most important stories.